everyone! In this video, we're going to talk about derivatives of sine and cosines, and we'll be able to use these rules moving forward as we differentiate different functions. So let's start with the derivative of sine. Before we take the derivative of sine, I want to remind you guys of a couple of things that are going to be necessary solving this. The first is the first two are two squeeze theorem limits that you might remember. So the limit as delta of x approaches 0, sine delta x over delta x is going to equal 1. The limit as delta x approaches 0 of 1 minus cosine of delta x over delta x equals 0. And then, so these two limits are from our section on the squeeze theorem, which we were able to find. And there's one more identity that you want to know. You might have learned this in previous courses, but if I have the sine of two angles added together, that's the same as the sine of the first times the cosine of the second, plus sine of the second times cosine of the first. So this is an angle sum identity. All right, now that we have those taken care of, we can find this derivative, and we're going to have to do that using the limit definition. So the derivative of sine x is going to be limit as delta x approaches 0, sine x plus delta x over delta x minus sine x. All right, and I'm going to expand using that angle sum identity up there. So it's going to become sine x cosine delta x plus sine delta x cosine x minus sine x over delta x. And because this is one big long fraction with a common denominator, I'm going to rearrange things and break it up into two different fractions, which is going to let us see what we can simplify a little bit more easily. So I can write this as limit is delta x approaches 0, sine x cosine delta x minus sine x over delta x, and then plus sine delta x over delta x cosine x. Now, if you see here, we have the limit as delta x approaches 0, sine delta x over delta x. This just becomes 1. Okay, so my second part is already taken care of. So I really just need to figure out what to do here with this sine x cosine delta x minus sine x. And I can actually factor out a sine x. And that looks pretty close to this one up here. But the issue is I have cosine of delta x minus 1 instead of sine, or instead of 1 minus cosine of delta x. But if instead of pulling out a positive sign, I pull out a negative sign, what's in here becomes 1 minus cosine delta x. And I still have my cosine x at the end. Okay, but so this now, based on this identity, just goes to 0. So I have now the limit as delta x approaches 0 of 0 plus cosine x. Well, there's no delta x left to plug in. I'm just left with cosine x. So the derivative of sine just ends up being cosine. So now let's find the derivative of cosine. In order to do that, I'm going to need my same theorems as before. So that limit as delta x approaches 0, sine delta x over delta x equals 1. Limit as delta x approaches 0 of 1 minus cosine delta x over delta x equals 0. And then also another angle sum formula, but this time for the sum with cosine. So the cosine of two angles added together is the cosine of the first, cosine of the second, minus sine of the first times sine of the second. All right, so now that I have those kind of up top so I can look at them, I'm going to use my limit definition. And then I'm going to expand accordingly to the angle sum identity. And just like with my derivative of sine, I'm going to rearrange this a little bit so I can see what simplifies. And you might already see here, okay, I have a sine delta x over delta x, that's got to go to 1. So this piece just becomes, oops, wrong color. This piece just becomes minus sine x. For this first term, I'm going to factor out a negative cosine x. When I do that, I end up with negative cosine delta x plus 1 over delta x, but negative cosine delta x plus 1, that's the same as 1 minus cosine delta x. And I have a familiar little term here, which is from this one. So that goes to 0. So I really have negative cosine x times, oops, sorry, I forgot my limit. The limit is delta x approaches 0. Negative cosine x times 0 minus sine x. But this just goes to 0, and I have negative sine x. Therefore, the derivative of cosine x is negative sine x.